It sounds fairly quiet out there now, so I'm going to take that as an opportunity to go ahead and get started. We're here together until 4 o'clock, which should give us plenty of time before this great community reception and a keynote this evening. So let me start today just by acknowledging that we are here together on Treaty 4 territory, which is the territory of the Nitty-Gritty and the Anishinaabe, the Nakota, the Lakota, and the Dakota people, and also neighboring Métis communities. My name is Leah Levac, and I work in the traditional territory of the Attawandaron people, which is now treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we are neighbored by the Haudenosaunee, which we in school would have learned as the Iroquois, so the Six Nations Confederacy, and we also have Anishinaabe and Métis neighbors in our area. I also want to thank the Community Research Unit and everybody else for inviting me here. So I just wanted to start, I can't help but sort of give us a structure for how the next hour and a half is going to go. That's because this is the way my brain works, and I feel disjointed when I don't have it. So we're going to start with sort of an introductory set of discussions in small groups, just so that we can learn a little bit more about each other. I'm going to introduce you to myself and also talk a little bit about what I hope we're going to be able to accomplish together in the next hour and a half. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the principles that guide my work as a critical community engaged scholar. We can have discussions about those as the workshop progresses, but my purpose for offering those is also part of my punchline, which is that the nitty-gritty or the practices of doing good collaborative research are the manifestation of your principles. And so for me, it's sort of important for you to understand how I try to ground my work so that the rest of what I have to say hopefully makes some sense. I've decided that I'm going to organize this conversation about specific practices into what we might think about as 3 major stages of a project. So the way we initiate working together, the way we maintain and support partnerships over time, and then the way we think about evaluating and assessing projects. We're going to have, in each of those sections, I'm going to give you a couple of examples from my own work. I'm going to talk about a couple of challenges associated with each of those stages. And then I'm going to try and give you, without being too academic, a handful of references of people who I think offer some good ideas in these areas. And then at the end of each subsection, we're going to have group discussion and then a whole discussion at the end. So I hope there'll be a fair sort of back and forth of chance for people to participate and also a chance for us to dialogue together as a whole group. Couple of sort of final organizational points. I am happy to share my slides with you. I am happy to send you hard copies of the examples that I give you during the presentation and during the workshop. I'm also happy to send you, if I make reference to an article, one of the things that I've learned as someone who's fortunate and to be based in a university is that sometimes the thing that community partners need the most is access to information that we take for granted because we have like a cajillion and one academic resources at our fingertips all of the time that are behind expensive firewalls. So if I mention an article that you think sounds really interesting, I am happy to send that article to you. I've put, so the only expectation then is that you email me to ask me for what you want, and then I'll send it to you in turn. So I've brought a bunch of my cards, and they're up here for you at the end. Finally, I'm here for the whole time, and I'm going to focus mostly on things that I think we have had some success with over the years in our work. I'm going to regale you with challenges on one of the panels in a couple of days from now. So please don't take my sunshine and bubbles examples today as evidence of me overlooking all of the challenges that I've faced as well. Okay, so let's move on to some introductions. So what I would like to do, because of the size of the group, I'm hoping that you can just sort of turn to the 3 or 4 people around you and take about 5 minutes, introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about what has brought you to this workshop, like to this 3-day event. And then if there are specific questions that you came into this room thinking, gosh, I hope she answers question X, can you make a point of writing those down so that I can try and weave those into the conversation as we go? So your name, what brings you here, and any particular questions that you're hoping will be answered by this workshop. Hey Mark, get set, go. I just want to take a minute to see if there were some particular questions that emerged in your group where you thought to yourself, you know, here's something that I'm really hoping to learn more about over the next now hour and 15 minutes. Does anybody have any specific questions? I almost left the room because I walked by this group as they were saying, we just want to know what really works. I was like, oh yeah, I'm out of here. So maybe, does anybody have any easier questions than that they'd like to offer? Yes.
Yeah, we still want to insist on that question.
Okay, I've written it down right here. What actually, okay. All right, I've got it. What else? Any other sort of specific questions? Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that there's an implication that sometimes, or at least that we're ongoing in the event is that we have a project already ongoing. What's it like to be in and out of projects? Like that's the other side.
Okay, so.
It's already started.
Right, and I think this is something that came up a little bit in a discussion. We will try to, I will try to talk a little bit about, because I agree with you, there is often this assumption that the project is sort of already exists, and what happens when we're trying to initiate something, what are the actual practicalities of trying to do that, okay? Yeah?
Okay, so do you tell one funder that you got funding from another funder? For a similar but different project.
Okay.
So does one need to know what the other's doing?
Yeah. I am almost sure that I won't do a very good job with that question. But it's an interesting, I'll have it rolling around in my head, and if we don't get to talk about it during the workshop, I promise I'll come back to you with it to sort of learn more about the situation. Cindy, was that a hand?
I'll put up my hand if you get to it. It'd be nice. One thing that came up in the last workshop, and it has left me thinking about actions coming out of participatory research, and so actions that get stopped, that never go anywhere, or that are successful. So any of those sort of dimensions.
Okay. Great. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Just maybe some suggestions on how to initiate getting to build a relationship. Maybe when you're asked to research on a community that you necessarily aren't part of, but it's an expectation of your professional work.
That sounds personal.
Yes.
How to engage government so that it's not only a one-way street, and that something might actually come out of it in terms of action or change.
Right.
How to change popular narratives.
Oh, yeah. Okay, this is getting worse. I'm more comfortable with what actually works, I think. Okay, so let's see what we can do with some of these. Is there anything else out there that, but again, so the plan is that there'll be lots of time for discussion and questions at the end. So you don't need to feel like you've missed the boat at this point. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself to give you some context for where what follows comes from. Like I said, my name is Leah Levac, and I'm based in a political science department at the University of Guelph. But I did not train as a political scientist, and I was not hired by the Department of Political Science. I was hired by the College of Social and Applied Human Sciences to work as a community engaged scholar. So the University of Guelph has a mandate to try and promote community university collaborations in research, teaching, and service. And at the time of my hire, they were trying to sort of build capacity within the institution by bringing researchers to the institution whose commitments aligned with the commitments of participatory or collaborative research. So the work that I do then in this area is effectively twofold. On the one hand, I do have an active research program, and I collaborate with communities broadly around the question of how marginal publics are participant or not in policy decision-making processes. So that's sort of so notions of knowledge democracy and of participatory democracy sort of frame some of the work that I do. On the other hand, though, I spend a lot of time internally at my institution thinking about the ways that institutions can do better at being good community partners, right? So how do we disrupt the power imbalances that are inherent and that often favor the university? So in turn then, as a practitioner in that environment, part of my responsibility is to sort of understand my own privilege and because of my location, and then think about ways that I use that privilege to disrupt existing power structures. So this will probably sneak in and out of the things that you hear me say today. So besides sort of gathering some of your questions, I also just wanted to say that I tried to think of some questions that I hope will be useful for me to answer by the end of today. So some of them did come up already around initiation. So I will say something about promising practices for implementing critical community engaged scholarship across the life of a project. I'm also going to try in my examples to link them specifically back to some of my guiding principles so that you can see this translation from sort of my lofty ideas to what that actually looks like in a day-to-day way. So what are examples of how we can do this? And then what can we do? What are some options available to us when something goes sideways? And my sort of my subtext here is because something always goes sideways. And so we need to be prepared for that. And then finally, what I'm hoping also is that whatever we sort of come up with together, it will give you some ideas for what next step can I take in whatever the work is that I'm doing, right? So whether or not I'm a community partner looking to initiate a new project for the first time, or a grad student who's really interested in working on a community-based project but doesn't really know where to get started, or you've hit a roadblock in an existing project, hopefully there will be some nuggets that will give you some thoughts about next steps. Okay, so a little bit about the principles that guide my work. I'm not going to read through all of these principles, but I do want to say that where they come from is a combination of work that my community and university colleagues and I have done over time. So particularly that first list that comes from a project on thinking about, that Cindy was involved with as well, that comes from thinking about ways that we can link Indigenous and Western ways of knowing for the purpose of doing more respectful community research where we operate sort of with integrity. So, and the other piece of that project was then how we match that with a commitment to the academic language is intersectionality scholarship. What that means in practice is understanding the dynamics of power in relationships. And so these principles come from, like I say, a combination of literature in the field, but also from my own practice. And ultimately, like I said earlier, the reason that I'm sharing these with you and the reason that I use the language critical is because it is my belief that my practices are a manifestation of my principles. And so I have to keep these front and center. And one of the very tangible ways that I use my principles is that when things start to go sideways, I can ask myself, what is going on here? Like, what am I missing, right? What is the problem? Why have I messed up a commitment to this relationship and spent too much time focusing on the project that we're working on? And then how can I sort of dial myself back and redirect in the way that I need to direct? So another way that I can use these when I'm sort of going, when things are not going the way I want them to be going, is to say, okay, what could I do in this situation that would still demonstrate my commitment to reciprocity, right? So that's probably, I'm speaking a little bit generally, but one of the challenges that often you can face in community-based research when you live in an academic institution that pushes you to produce outputs at sometimes an unreasonable rate is this sense that if there's a problem stewing, you just have to fix it so that you can keep moving, right? And I can push myself back from the edge of just fixing it the way I think it should be fixed by kind of forcing myself to stop and say, that would not be reciprocal, right? Like, we would not both be agreeing and giving and getting something if I were just to go ahead and try and fix this. So this is sort of what I mean by using those principles. The last thing I'll say about that first list is that, of course, any of you who work in Indigenous contexts, who are yourself an Indigenous person or scholar, these words are words that come up a lot in conversations about research ethics, working with Indigenous people, and so on. I'm happy to offer you some more detailed definitions about any of them at any point. But what like I said, the reason for this particular collection of them is because we looked at them not only in terms of how they upheld Indigenous knowledge systems, but also how they uphold sort of what we would call critical Western knowledge systems, and also how they sort of are shared across these systems. Because one of the challenges that we face is this sort of competition between different ways of knowing. Does anybody have any questions about those principles before I move on? No, yeah.
When you look at kind of commitment to the relationship and understanding, the risk, I can never say it right, but the give and take, right?
Right,
Back
yep.
and forth. To me, it's kind of subjective. Are there any specific kind of guiding principles? Because one person can think they're doing it, the next person can think that that's, not how you work with the community, and the community can interpret it somewhat differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
So while these are good, what's the practical, real life kind of pieces of what you should or should not
So I don't want to punch your question, but I am going to try and show you a couple of tools that we use where we sort of explicitly try and lay some of these things out. And if I still haven't answered the question enough, sort of after that, we'll come back to it, okay? Because I think it's a really good point, and I think that's one of the things sort of I'm hoping here is to say, probably many of us in the room have seen those words before and said, yeah, like respect, we get it. But when we actually go to sort of say, what do I do to be respectful? It's like, I don't know. Like, so yeah, it's a fair point, and hopefully I will get into some of it, and then otherwise we'll come back. Any other? Okay. Okay. So you don't need to be able to read this text, so don't worry about that. I just want to sort of put it up there by way of example. So I'm going to start now with the initiating projects, right? So initiation, then what I mean when I'm talking about initiation is the stage where the partnership emerges or sort of research questions are invited by one side or the other. And it is certainly the case that the literature is quite clear that really true community-based research or collaborative research answers questions that are important to communities. It is also true that communities don't always know. They know all about the problems that they're dealing with, but they don't necessarily know how those problems translate into research questions, right? And I don't, in the same way that research-trained people don't always understand the problems, right? So I'm going to suggest that even though ultimately the question has to be important to the community, sometimes it is the case that these projects emerge from a place where researchers are involved in the community in other ways, and then sort of start to see problems that they can help frame as research questions. So I'm saying this because I think that this is a two-way relationship, right? I think that this initiation can happen from the community, and it can also happen from the university. A lot of times they come from referrals, right? So somebody is working already in a community, and the organization says, you know what we really need is somebody who can help us with this, and then the relationships start to build that way. A lot of times, the number one advice that I give to people who are interested in community work or community-driven research is to go and be useful in community organizations, right? Absent of any sort of research agenda, go do something useful. Because the more useful you can be to a community, the more sort of, the starting point is more reciprocal, right? Volunteering on boards, offering to write grant applications, sending literature, doing the heavy lifting of that community organizations do, so that you understand the kind of work that is going on there. I would say that even when you've got a long-standing collaboration between a university-based research unit and a community organization, you still go through the act of initiating partnership around specific projects, sometimes over and over and over again, right? So I have a long-standing collaboration with a group of women in Happy Valley Goose Bay in Labrador, but we initiate new phases of research all the time, right? And every time we're undertaking this initiation stage. So I'm trying to make this general enough to make sense both in sort of a cold situation, we don't have a previous relationship, to one where we have an ongoing relationship. So I want to give you two examples then that I think are helpful things to think about when it comes to project initiation. This example, which like I say, you don't need to be able to read the actual text, but it comes from a collaboration that I'm involved with the Haisla Nation and the Tamatik status of women in the district of Kitimat, which is on the western coast, sort of central western coast of British Columbia. And that project sort of generally is focused on trying to understand diverse women's well-being in that community in the context of major and ongoing resource extraction, right? Boom and bust cycles. And this is an example of a terms of reference document that we created between the advisory committee of that community project and the university-based research team, right? So example number 1 is about creating actual terms of reference. So the advisory committee is a group of Indigenous and settler women who live and work in Kitimat and the Haisla Nation. Their reserve is called Kitimat Village. So who live and work in Kitimat and the Haisla Nation, and who are effectively the advisors of this project. So in this terms of reference document, we developed over about 4 months or so, 4 to 6 months, a set of principles that we worked out bit by bit in terms of how we would work together, right? And this document includes everything from why we're working together as an advisory group, to who the members of our advisory group will be, to what kind of work plan we will have, to how we will resolve disagreements when we are not in consensus about how the project should proceed. And ultimately, this advisory group is sort of the arbiter or the guide that provides the guidance for the overall project. So this effectively, this takes away some of the, already is about sort of power sharing, in the sense that it takes away the power of the university-based researcher to say, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to do it, here's how we're going to work together, because we worked out all of these agreements together and we all sort of stay committed to them. The second example that I want to give you, and that I did not put up on a slide, but that I did bring a couple of hard copy handouts that can be circulated, that relates to project initiation, comes from a very different context, and the context there is that I teach a 4th year and graduate class in community politics, and one of the things that we do in that class is that students work in small groups with a community organization to answer a research question that has been posed by the community, but with the support of the unit on our campus that's called the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute, to help try and scope that actual project. So in that class, one of the things that we do, which is also something that I do in my bigger research programs, is create a 1 or 2 page overview that is a starting point for how we understand what it is that we think we're going to do together, right? So essentially, what exactly is the question that we're trying to answer, and what are students going to produce at the end, and in what context, or why is this work together important, right? So why bother, what are we going to do, and what is it going to look like at the end? And the reason that we produce these documents is very similar to the reason that we produce shared guiding principles for that initiation of the project, right? Which is that oftentimes we can sit in a room and say, okay, yeah, we get it. And then when everybody scurries off into their own sort of worlds, we actually didn't really understand what we thought we were supposed to be doing. So this sample has 2 different projects described. One that was about an environmental scan of municipalities' efforts towards truth and reconciliation, particularly in the form of building cultural competency within their municipalities. And the second was in partnership with the Community Health Center in Guelph. And our mandate, our focus there was on how to meaningfully involve homeless and difficult to house or marginally housed citizens in the decision making of the Community Health Center, right? So it was so these were the two projects that were described here. So that's a sort of second example. You can also the other important thing about this initiation stage in describing these projects is to scope it to be the right size, right? So one of the big challenges that we deal with frequently, that we're getting better at, but is that it's sometimes hard to gauge what a third-year class of students can handle compared to what a graduate student can handle compared to what a faculty member, right? So scoping these projects based on the resources that are available from the university side and the resources that are available from the community side is an important piece of that puzzle. So I think these two examples, both which share this sort of commitment to writing down things that we agree to, one about scoping the project, one about agreeing to how the project is going to be overseen and what kinds of principles and questions are going to guide the project, are really important parts of initiating that relationship. And I think that they also reflect a commitment to respect, which is one of the principles that I mentioned. I think they're also examples of, to me, this is one of the places where we establish reciprocity, because we lay it right out there and we say, here's what we're going to do and here's what you're going to get in return. This is what you're going to have to put in. This is what we're going to put in. Does this seem fair? Right? Like, is this workable and agreeable? And I think it also upholds this idea that we can sort of embed that we don't know the answers to these questions that are of community importance without working together as partners. So a couple of challenges here. There are many, but the one that I just want to mention briefly here is that one of the challenges that I find the most compelling at the initiation stage is this sort of tension between establishing these expectations and making everything clear and making space for emergence, right? So on the one hand, we're reacting to things that we don't know are coming yet, right? Because a community's problems evolve with the real world and with day-to-day life, right? And yet, if we go in without sort of some of these structured parameters, my experience has been that things can go willy-nilly and not be particularly productive. So, you know, I don't have a perfect answer to this question of how we balance it, except to say that we always treat these documents as tentative, right, as points in time, and as things that we renegotiate over time. So we would take a community advisory meeting, if I go back to the example of the terms of reference document, we would every 6 months or so at a community advisory meeting, we would say we just want to go back to the terms of reference and make sure that we still all feel okay about what's here. You know, are we upholding what we meant to uphold, for example. So another challenge, and this relates to something I said sort of off the cuff earlier about going and making yourself useful in communities, is that one of the challenges that gets discussed around project initiation in the literature is this notion of trying to find community gatekeepers. So who are the people in communities who provide sort of links, right? We all have people who provide links in our own sort of personal networks. Well, there are people who we sort of understand also provide links in community networks, or who also understand sort of some of the dynamics and things that are going on within a community. So I don't know how you find community gatekeepers except by being engaged in the communities of which you are a part, right? So that's going to sound like an imperfect answer, but I think it's useful to think about the fact that when we are engaging in communities, part of what we are trying to do, and similarly, when community members are engaging with universities, there are also gatekeepers inside those institutions. And so part of it is about continuing to sort of build networks and relationships to see sort of what sorts of pieces stick eventually, I guess is what I would say. Okay, let me just give you a couple of useful references that say some more about initiating, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation about initiating. So there's a 2010 article by scholars in, actually right next to me at the University of Waterloo, called Joanna Ochoa and Moorleg's first name I forget, and Rich Jansen. And that paper is called A Framework for Entry. And they did a multi-year research project on culturally relevant mental health services in Waterloo and Toronto. And they talk a lot about the actual practices that they used in sort of initiating and entering these entering communities to have these conversations. One of the important points that I'll note is that they talk about the importance of learning as much about the context as you can, sort of before you enter a situation. And they call this the pre-engagement phase. So what happens even before a project starts. There's another online resource by a woman named Leslie Brown who works in social economy research. She's based on the East Coast. And that project, she's got a chapter in an online book that's about social economy research. And in that chapter, she points out a couple of things. First of all, she implores us not to refer to community partners as the non-academic partners because of the sort of implication that communities don't hold knowledge or researchers or in them. And the other thing, another important thing that she says is to talk about understanding why you're partnering, right? So having frank discussions about why you're choosing to work together. And besides, and this may dance a little bit into your funding question, besides to each other, to whom is this partnership accountable and in what ways? Right, so making sure that these parameters of your collaboration are clear.
What's the name of this website?
It is an online book called Community University Research Partnerships, Reflections on the Canadian Social Economy Experience. The last one that I want to, another point that links to the last reference I want to give you here is that Leslie also draws this distinction between transactional relationships and transformational relationships. And I'm doing this for transaction because these are like the short one-off, we need a literature review about X so that we can apply for funding stream Y, right? That is a very transactional kind of community partnership. They're also much broader, longer term, sort of transformational, social justice oriented, structural, sort of initiated projects. Generally, the literature and community engaged scholarship favors these long-term transformational projects. There's a really interesting article by a group of graduate students. The first author is Hubrig. It's from 2017. And the first title of the first part of the title is called Positionality and Possibility. And these grad students walk through the experience of trying to initiate a community university collaboration and try to aim for transformation and then decide to focus on some transactional elements And the main argument that they make in this paper is that grad students don't have the same kind of institutional resources available to them that faculty members do. And so sometimes promising a transformational project when you can't actually make that long-term commitment the way I can, who has like a permanent job and access to resources, can create a different set of problems. So I think they make a really interesting, they just present a really interesting discussion about there's sort of this wave from transactional to transformational collaborations and how a group of grad students have navigated a project like this. So I thought that you might find that useful. Okay. So I'm going to stop for a minute. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to distill your thoughts and think about these questions or questions that you have for me, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion about this initiating part. Okay, so do you have any questions for me, or do you have any strategies that you found really useful that you'd like to share with us, or any cautionary tales that you'd like to share with us? Does anybody either have any couple of particular strategies that they've used that they've found useful and would like to share, or any points that they want to raise about cautions, or any questions for me based on some of the things that I've just offered?
I guess I have a question.
Okay, great.
With the cautionary tale side of it, so if you're really engaged in getting the question from the community, how do you keep it from getting too big and out of control that it's just out of your scope? If they want to come to you with a problem that's just far too huge for you to deal with.
So, right. So first of all, I have a couple of different parts of answers to this question. My one part would be that actually being able to recognize this is really important, and the most important thing that you can do is be honest about that. In my experience, to be able to say that does not fit within the sort of parameters of what's possible. Can we talk about something that's this big, right, instead of something that's this big? So I actually think that acknowledging that, I have never worked with an organization where if you haven't been honest to say, I want to do good work, and the only way to do good work in collaboration with you is to do work that I can handle. I've never met an organization that has said, well, forget it then, right? Or if they do, then that's fair, right? Because if you go back to the questions of like, why are we working together? If you can't meet their needs, then it's not a good fit. So that's sort of my one answer, is being clear about that. And oftentimes, we at Guelph, we actually often send a sort of a community engaged learning coordinator in with students to help them say that's too big. Because students can be really driven to say, okay, and then come back to their advisor and say, here's what we're going to do. And their advisor is like, no, you're not. Like, that's right. So sometimes getting people to help you do sort of say that as well, I think is really useful. My broader answer to this question is something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about on Wednesday, but it is that for me, this is the #1 reason that community research units at academic institutions can be really valuable, and that is that we can see them as places that hold research relationships precisely so that the piece that you can take on is actually understood as being part of a bigger picture, and that then somebody else can take on the next piece, and somebody else can take on the next piece, right? This is something that in my experience universities do not do very well right now, but it's something that we're diligently working at Guelph because we understand this exact problem. So those are sort of a couple of thoughts. be honest about the scope, get help from someone to be honest about it if you can't do it, right? Which I don't mean sort of disparagingly, but it's hard. I mean, I do it too sometimes, and then, you know, find myself with my tail between my legs, either that or, you know, crying because I haven't slept enough. Okay, so that's my answer to that question. Anybody tips on initiating relationships that they've, or partnerships that they found useful? Yeah.
So I had an experience early in my career. It was my first job out of grad school where I was approached. I was working for a citywide nonprofit organization doing economic development work. I was approached by a national organization who got a huge grant, wanted to go into communities and understand the dynamics of entrepreneurs and businesses within communities as part of a larger sort of policy research project they were doing. So I sort of got the okay from my executive director to gather some of our interns and junior staff and start this project. About a weekend, we got this phone call from one of the organizations within the community that we were going out to saying, what the heck? You're stepping on our toes. How dare you sort of come into our community and go right to the grassroots level without consulting us first? In the end, what we ended up doing is putting the national organization in touch with this community-based organization and removing ourselves from the project. But it was a really good exercise for me in thinking I had the grassroots kind of links, but missing that middle sphere, which was a business improvement district that felt like they knew the community better than anyone else. So kind of missing that intermediary local organization.
That's a good example. Thanks for sharing. And sort of understanding that existing kind of context. Any other, yeah, Cindy.
There's, I guess, a strategy, I don't think about it this way, but in Indigenous methodologies that's called relational networks, and that's, you know, auntie, sister, and, you know, like people related in some way, bringing them all in, or snowballing, I guess would be another way of talking about it. And is one thing, and I think another one is, you know, just joining organizations or community-based organizations so that you get experience working with organizations, or having coffee and tea with people, you know, especially if you're working in communities. I think you need to sit down and talk to people and find out where they're at, and I think that needs to actually become a really regular thing. And I know that there's one very well-known feminist organization in Nicaragua, and if you're wearing high-heeled shoes, they won't even talk to you. So, you know, being appropriate, like, because they're farmers, they're women farmers. So, you know, like, doing what's appropriate for the organization you're working with on multiple layers, I think is important.
Mm-hmm. And some of that is the how, too. I was engaging with an organization that I thought had a pretty good model, and I won't mention who they are because I ended up walking away, because they found money through the federal government to hire some students to come into Regina and knock on doors, and I thought, for 8 weeks, and that's a huge resource, because I've come to the conclusion the real way to do anti-poverty work right now is the same way as a good old-fashioned labor organization, actually talking to people, because the anti-poverty space in Regina involves relatively few actually poor people. And one of the things, though, that it did talk about, because it's an international organization, was get groups involved with each other right away. Because one of the narratives around poor people is that racial divide. I'm poor because I've had a misfortune, but you're poor because you're lazy, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes some of the networks are exclusive. They do tend to be. So you need to find networks that don't necessarily network with one another. And I see that
I'm talking about individuals versus groups.
Yeah, and so how to bridge that too, because you get the narrative is my poverty is different from your poverty, which it is, because poverty is highly racialized, but it allows this group to say, I'm poor because of misfortune and I'm going to be rich someday if I'm a good entrepreneur. But you're just lazy, right?
So, I mean, I think that the maybe if I can draw out a cautionary tale here is that also when we are building relationships, we are looking for common values and principles with organizations that we choose to work with, right? So sometimes we choose to work with some organizations or some groups of people and not others. And so certainly I have also had to walk away from collaborations because they weren't the right, we didn't share sort of the core values, you know, and that can happen. So last thing I'll say before I move us on to partnership maintenance in a slightly quicker speed, because I realize I took too long in that phase, but I think it's important, is that I mentioned here, and I'll just say it out loud for the group, somebody asked me, well, one of the challenges we have with initiating is where do you get that little bit of money that you need to get things started to build this relationship? So this is one possibility is that so there are 3 national funding research councils in the country. One of them is called the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and they are who social scientists primarily apply to, who are often the people who are involved in community research, though not always. And that organization, whose acronym is SHRC, or that funding body, has just announced a new type of funding that's called a Partnership Engage Grant. It's for 1 year. It's worth between $7,000 and $25,000, depending on what you ask for. And the 3 rules are you have to partner with one organization, so it's not a big initiative. It's like, I'm going to work with you on this. You have to be answering a compelling and immediate question that's a problem for the organization, right? And what makes something compelling is that in order to do what you need to do, you have to know the answer to this first, right? So it's like, we have to do this or else. We won't be able to do that. And it has to be research, right? So it can't be exclusively knowledge sharing. You have to be answering a new question, right? Something that we don't already know the answer to. So if you know someone who works in an academic setting and you are an organization, that's a place that you can send them. Say, please go check SHRC's Partnership Engage grants and see if maybe we could apply for one of those. So that's my sort of one tidbit of funding information. Okay. Really quick, so partnership maintenance is the second stage, right? So we've got partnership initiated. We want to talk about maintaining partnerships over time. I want to give you a couple of really brief examples of what that can look like at a really big scale and at a really small scale. So this is an example of a big scale. So this is a partnership that I was involved with that lasted for 4 years, and it was called, the project was called Changing Public Services. Broadly, what we were concerned about was how diverse women were experiencing rapid changes to public services, both as service users, sort of that is like citizens, and as service providers, so public sector workers. The reason that I'm putting this diagram up here is that the literature basically across the board when it comes to maintaining partnerships talks about governance structures to oversee these big projects. And one of the primary features of these governance structures is that they are meant to disrupt the power imbalances that are inherent between the university-based partners and the community-based partners. So my first example here is about designing one of these governance structures where shared decisions get made about a project and where the model makes sense for what you're trying to accomplish. So in this project, we had sort of an organizing group that was comprised of a community organization, as the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. We also had 2 university-based and 2 community-based lead members. So there were 4 people who led this national project. The community-based people were union folks because the major community partners were unions. Then we used 2 different universities in 2 different kinds of ways, right? One university provided us with space, the other one managed the finances with some exceptions. And then we built 4 regional teams. Each of these teams was led by both a university-based partner and a community-based partner, and they decided unique questions that they would answer at the regional level as a part of this partnership. So every year we would all get together and we would share what each cluster was learning. We would talk about some shared decisions together, and then we would go back to doing our work. And with this central leadership team meeting about every second month to sort of talk through, were there issues that were coming up that we needed to help manage, and so on. So this is a thumbnail sketch. Happy to talk more about this example in detail with you one-on-one. But just to say that one of the things that we think about when we think about maintaining partnerships is to think about how a project will be governed. And the answer to that question is by a structure that you create, right? So you can't just leave the governance of a project to chance, because the university-based person will end up being bossy. That's how we'll say it. The other thing that we do in these community partnerships is that we have worked over the years, and this is sort of another practical tip about maintaining partnerships. We transfer money wherever we can to community organizations. We do it for 2 reasons. First, to support the capacity of the community organization and to value them as equal partners in the collaboration. So that's one. The other reason, though, is that one of the big barriers to maintaining meaningful partnerships is that the financial accountability structures of universities are outrageous, and they are not conducive to moving money easily to support the work that's going on in communities. And so because of that barrier, we have, and it's possible that I should probably be a little bit tempered in what I say, but because of that challenge, we have worked hard as university-based people committed to participatory research to find totally legitimate ways to make sure that community partners are not out of pocket for the work of the collaboration, right? And universities almost always operate on reimbursement systems, right? You spend the money and then I'll pay it back to you at some unforeseen time in the future, which is not okay for a lot of people who are in community organizations. And so this is another sort of important practicality to think about. So that's an example of a big tool for maintaining partnerships. This is an example of a much more specific tool. This is a project that I'm involved with in Happy Valley Goose Bay in Labrador. And what I really want to say, again, this is not, I don't need you to be able to read this text in particular, but the example here is that partners in, so there are, we think about building collaborations that have both these advisory groups who are research partners, but then also participants in the research process who are a different kind of partner. And one of the big ways that power gets structured strangely and unfairly in research projects is through the university ethics process, which is grounded in a good idea of free, prior, and informed consent, but which manifests itself into really long, nonsensical consent forms that are difficult to understand and that don't really respect the way communities share knowledge. So one of the things that we have tried to do in this work is to create the equivalent of a consent form, but we call them, and we've borrowed from other work, and the name is escaping me right now, so I apologize for that. And to call them mutual assistance pacts. And the idea here is that instead of asking a participant to consent to being effectively a research subject, we are trying to create an agreement for how we will provide mutual assistance to each other, right? And part of this is about revealing the grounds on which the university members of the team are participating and how we stand to benefit, right? So, but also trying to say, folks in the community collaborative, here's how they stand to benefit from participating. Community members, here's how they stand to benefit from participating. This is the important point. In these processes, we leave blanks and we negotiate these other things. So we as a research team sit together and say, here are some things that we can think of in terms of how you might how you might benefit from this project. What else do you want to get out of this work, right? So how do I make sure that this is beneficial for you because I know that it's beneficial for me? And then we negotiate those pieces, we write them into the mutual assistance pact, everybody signs it, that becomes our consent form. So this is a sort of another example of a way that we can uphold some of these principles, like reciprocity, like relationality, in the context of doing research with community partners. Cindy, did you have a question?
How do you present that to ethics? Like that?
Yep.
You get a lot of them coming back?
So the question was, how do you present this to a research ethics board at the university? This is a highly variable. The way that research ethics gets implemented at universities across the country is highly variable. So partly, this was approved by the University of Manitoba, which is where we were working through this project at the time. I can say at the University of Guelph, we've come a long way in terms of sort of thinking about how to actually do ethical research, right? So I think that I could do this at the University of Guelph too, though I've never tried because this predates my tenure at Guelph. But the best sort of general answer I can give you is that I always think about my ethics applications as an education process with my research ethics board. We do a lot of back and forth to say, well, but what you're asking me to do would not actually be ethical for these kinds of reasons. And so instead, and then sometimes we meet in the middle. Another conversation that I'm happy to have in more detail with folks who are interested. So let me talk about a challenge in this sort of broad scope of partnership maintenance, and that is that maintaining projects, I have found a real challenge. It connects to the discussion this morning about action and where action fits in and what even action is. A challenge in project maintenance is, on the one hand, trying to answer long-term questions that a community partner and a research partner have, and in the short term, dealing with pressing, urgent issues, right? So how do we keep our eye on the long game while not dismissing the fact that people's lives are being affected today by things that we are sort of trying to think about, right? This is a tension that I don't think that there's an easy answer to, except that you have to keep revisiting and say, are we okay with this? Do we need to stop the long game for a minute to focus on something that's more pressing right now? And if we do, let's do that, and what does that look like, right? And sometimes it means working with different groups of a community partner on different pieces, right? So sometimes we work on something over here with a particular segment of a community partner, and then members of the community organization maybe are more interested in this longer term question, and we can maintain those pieces together. So that's a challenge in this area. I've already given you a couple of pieces. So the Ochoka article and the Brown article also talk about maintaining partnerships and some strategies for maintaining partnerships. A couple of new ones that I want to offer here. One by Tremblay, Crystal Tremblay and Bud Hall at the University of Victoria. And it's a study of 20 community university research partnerships across Canada. It was published in 2014, and they look at how these projects governed themselves, how they measured their impacts, and so on. So that article is called Learning from Community University Research Partnerships. And then one other article that I want to mention is the first author is Tobias, and it's a 2013 article called Community-Based Participatory Research with Indigenous Communities, Producing Respectful and Reciprocal Research. And one of the things, they're geographers, and they talk about doing respectful community research with partners within a geography context. A focus in that article that I haven't heard talked about yet is that they go to some length to talk about collaborative data analysis. So how do we actually work together to analyze and understand the data that's coming out of these partnerships? And in my experience, we have the number one thing that we have done to try and do collaborative data analysis is to actually create sort of mini workshops within our research teams where the community partners and the university partners work together to create the framework that we're going to use to look at the data, and then we all go away and we apply that framework to the same piece of data. We come back and we talk about it, and then we go off and look at the data together, right? So it is an iterative process, right? And by that I mean we sort of keep revisiting how we're looking at the data over time. But the important part of it is that first we agree on what we're looking for, right? Because you can give a focus group transcript to a community partner, and you can give the same transcript to an academic, a university-based researcher, and they can see very different things in that conversation, right? So our research is better when we do data analysis collaboratively. I'm going to come back to discussion in 1 minute because I just want to give you sort of one more example from the evaluation part, right? So last thing, I also brought you an example of those mutual assistance packs, if anybody wants to see an example of one of those. Finally, so this example is so new that it doesn't even exist yet. This is a proposal that we just worked up as part of a partnership that we're involved with in Kitimat and Haisla that I've already mentioned. So this last stage of practical details around project initiation, partnership, maintenance, and evaluation is to think about evaluating the project. And here, the point that I want to make with my practical example here is that what we've done is we've taken theoretical work that we've done, right, which is coming to these 7 principles that I already mentioned earlier and that govern the way that I think about this work. And now we're going to try and use those principles to build, with our community partners, a culturally responsive evaluation framework that they can then have so that they can evaluate other things going on in their communities to sort of see the extent to which those initiatives are upholding these commitments, right? These commitments to relationality, these commitments to reciprocity. We're going to test the model, though, on our own work together as a team. So the way we're going to start this is by saying, how well are we actually doing at sort of upholding the principle of reverence? And the community partners and us are going to work together to say, what would it look like if we were upholding reverence well? And then we're going to look at our work together over time and say, are we doing, did we do that? But the point of building it into a framework is, like I say, ultimately so that the community has a tool at the end, right? So we're not just evaluating the project. What we're doing is creating a tool that can become a useful kind of evaluation framework for future work when the goal is to be culturally responsive. Okay, so we're very close to the end of time, so I've taken up a little bit more time than I intended, for which I apologize. I'm wondering if there are some final questions in the room, either about partnership maintenance or about evaluation and assessment.
Again, a lot more granular than what you're talking about, but an interesting phenomenon. As part of my community association, like this has got no connection with academia at all, undertake a community survey based on one that had been done 10 years ago and sat on the shelf. And this one may be doomed to do the same. But they noted in that, even though it's a low-income community, it was noted how nobody being interviewed brought up poverty issues. And in the community survey part, I found the same thing, but the context was we were a community association that a lot of people see as a recreational association, which it isn't.
Okay.
And what comes out of the research is often an artifact of the context. So you may see a problem, you may hope it emerges from the research, but because of the context, it doesn't, even though it's there.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that I think I understand the problem that you're raising, and I certainly understand that those things can happen. I think the hope, the goal is that if you've agreed on and sort of developed the question together initially, then it does answer the question that you're trying to answer, right? I mean, it doesn't always, certainly, but that I can imagine that's a frustrating experience when it doesn't. Does anybody else have any? Yeah.
This isn't really, but will your slides be available basically? Because
I'm happy to send them to you as well. Yep, so again, I'll just ask you to take a card and email me and say, can you send me your slides? And then I will. Anybody else have any questions about any of the strategies, any of the, I'm disappointed that, I'm disappointed that we didn't get to we got to some of the questions. We didn't get to the question of how to engage the government slowly and with lots and lots of persistence is my short answer to that question. But I'm happy to I'll be around, so I'm happy to engage in these conversations more. I think we've got time for about one more question if anybody wants to have a final. Okay, so there are some printed examples of the things that I talked about. My card is here. I'll be around for the next 3 days. Thank you so much for your engagement in your group conversations. And I certainly hope that this has provided you some useful material.